Hello, I'm Geoff A. author of fantasy books, psychological fiction, short stories and dystopian thrillers. Welcome to my YouTube channel. In 2019 I retired from my job as a professor in geography at the University of Plymouth in the UK and have since become a full-time writer. Here are the books behind me I've written so far, which can all be purchased on Amazon. In this video I will talk about my novel Pandemic, which can be also purchased through Amazon. I will not only talk about the storyline and some of the content, but also about what motivated me to write this book, what the story is about, and which other authors influenced me. I will also mention what I found most difficult and enjoyed most when writing this book. I hope that this video will not only be interesting to existing and potential readers, but also to other authors keen to hear about the writing and publishing experience of writers like myself. You may also be interested to watch other short videos on this channel where I talk about my book writing strategy and other books I have written. So what motivated me to write this book? Pandemic is my third novel and was published in 2020 by Amazon KDP Publishing. As the title implies, this book was inspired by the COVID-19 pandemic, which started in February 2020 and which has since killed millions of people around the world. In early 2020 I was stuck at home in the UK during the first rather harsh and tightly controlled COVID lockdown, and what better way to use the time to write a book about the pandemic and how it affected friends, neighbours and the population as a whole. I was particularly interested in the psychological effects of the pandemic, how it affected people's behaviour, and also how it changed people's relationships with each other. So what is the story in Pandemic about? In this dystopian novel, so it is a work of fiction, the world is gripped by a deadly virus labelled by scientists as a lethal airborne respiratory disease, or LARD-19. Initially I wanted to talk directly about COVID-19, but Amazon Publishing quite rightly urged me to fictionalize the story using a made-up name for virus because of all the worrying fake news that was floating around about COVID. In the book, the virus LARD-19 develops into the worst catastrophe that has befallen humanity since the 1918-20 flu epidemic that killed between 20 to 50 million people worldwide, and since the bubonic plague pandemics of the 12th to 15th centuries that killed hundreds of millions in Europe. The story in Pandemic is based in Plimcombe, a small village on the south coast of Devon, near the city of Plymouth in the southwest of the UK. Plimcombe is used as a lens to show how a devastating pandemic such as LARD-19 can affect contemporary small communities and their vulnerable inhabitants, and how individuals from different backgrounds and walk of life cope, some better, some worse, in light of the unfolding disaster. The main characters in the story: Roger the academic, Dan the psychotherapist, Kevin and Dick the burglars, Josh and Jordan the twins, Beth the GP, single mom Lisa with her 2 young children, Bob and Melinda Hillier with their 2 sons, Horatio van Gelder the village hermit, Paddy the policeman. They all struggle to cope with the effects LARD-19 has on them and their families in their struggle for survival and their desperate but ultimately vain attempts to carry on with life as normal. None of the main protagonists in this novel know what course the pandemic will take in future, whether an effective vaccine will be developed and made available to everybody, or whether the lethal virus will flare up again in mutated form to wreak havoc in future. The virus outbreak in Pandemic has much more dramatic impacts than the COVID pandemic has had, at least so far, and leads to partial breakdown in society. As is often the case when societies face the ultimate challenge and begin to break down, be it through wars, natural catastrophes or pandemics, Some individuals rise above others in their altruism and in the ways they cope, but also in their own depraved needs and ambitions. It is this breakdown of social norms and networks caused by a pandemic that particularly interested me when writing the book. Pandemic is thus both a story about contemporary humanity's inability to cope with a global pandemic disaster and a story about fear, anger, redemption, jealousy, love, murder and despair, a warning that human life on planet Earth after global viral pandemics such as COVID-19 is unlikely to be the same socially, economically and psychologically for a long time to come. So which authors or movies influenced me when writing this book? This book falls into the category of dystopian novel, as it depicts a future where society with all its norms and regulations at least partially breaks down. As such, it is in line with many other dystopian thrillers written over the years that have based their storylines around disasters befalling humanity and society's struggles to cope. Many dystopian books could be mentioned here that have undoubtedly influenced me, but I will restrict myself to 4 books which I strongly recommend. I'll start with one of my favorite books, Doris Lessing's The Memoirs of a Survivor. This happens to be the German version. A great story about a society that is breaking apart and one girl's attempt to survive. I strongly recommend this, it's an excellent read. Pandemic also has parallels with a dystopian story told in Justin Cronin's recent book, The Passage, and David Breen's book, Existence, both of which engage in fascinating and chilling ways with how survivors cope, or do not cope, in a post-apocalyptic world. Finally, books such as The Drought, this is an older book by J.G. Ballard, also provided important inspirations for pandemic, especially in the way it shows humanity's failure to cope with large-scale disasters. Most influential, however, have been several recent movies about pandemics, especially Soderbergh's excellent and gripping movie Contagion, where he pretty much predicts accurately the sequence of events that the COVID pandemic has followed, including its likely provenance from a wet market in China, or Danny Boyle's 2002 chilling movie 28 Days Later, which shows a truly apocalyptic Britain in the wake of a deadly virus. These books and movies particularly show the psychological strain placed on humans affected by disasters and pandemics, storylines I was particularly keen to explore in great detail in Pandemic. So what did I find most difficult when writing this book? Writing Pandemic was a very good cathartic experience for me during COVID lockdown and partly helped me to get to grips with the psychological pressures and claustrophobia induced by the first lockdown in Britain. As Pandemic is linked to events unfolding regarding the COVID outbreak, one difficulty when writing the book, which was published in May 2020, so just a few months after COVID started, was to keep up with the ever-changing storyline of the real pandemic. But as the book is a novel, it gave me license to alter facts and to adjust the content to suit the storyline. Inevitably, I had to cut off the story sometime, which meant that the real COVID storyline diverged more and more from the story developed in Pandemic. But as this is a fictional novel, this did not matter, and the story soon took on its own life and momentum, with parts of the storyline inspired rather than dictated by what was happening with COVID. But often I had to make amendments while writing, especially when I introduced new, unforeseen aspects to the storyline, or indeed new characters that I had not thought about from the start. Any change made to any part of a complex book, such as Pandemic, then causes ripple effects that reverberate right through the book. This can be very tricky, and at this point you, as an author, have to make sure that you follow up on all the possible changes this may require. This is particularly difficult when you have to go back to parts of the book you wrote weeks or months ago and where you may have forgotten at least partly what you had already written. Related to this is also the difficulty of avoiding repetition and making sure that characters or occurrences described in earlier parts of the book match up with what you say about them later on. As a result, although the storyline is usually linear, book writing is not. You have to go back and forth all the time, double-checking here, making amendments there. All the time it is basically like going 2 steps forward and 1 step back. That's why it takes time to write a book. It's not just the writing process that takes time, but also the constant checking and back-checking that is needed throughout. But thorough editing of a book should iron out any possible inconsistencies, and if you are an author yourself, don't shy away from rewriting bits if they are not consistent with how your storyline developed in later stages of writing. After all, book writing is a creative process involving development and creation, but at times also destruction or deletion of what you have written before. What did I enjoy most when writing this book? I greatly enjoyed writing this book as I could use it as a means to express my own thoughts and theories about how society responded to an outbreak like COVID. Developing the main characters who appear in the book was particularly interesting and challenging. Roger, the academic, had to be brainy but also compassionate. Dan, the psychotherapist, had to deal with many of the psychological issues linked to the pandemic. Kevin and Dick, the burglars, had to be convincing in their often misguided and brutal deeds. Josh and Jordan, the twins, Beth the GP, and single mum Lisa with her 2 young children also fitted specific personalities affected in different ways by the pandemic. Bob and Melinda Hillier with their 2 sons who all flee from the virus in their yacht also had to be convincing in their often desperate decisions, as was Horatio Van Gelder, the village hermit, and Paddy, the policeman. I enjoyed writing about how they all struggle to cope with the effects the virus has on them and their families in their struggle for survival and their desperate but ultimately vain attempts to carry on with life as normal. I also greatly enjoyed writing certain parts of the book, such as the scenes unfolding on the island the Hillier family has escaped to, or, I have to admit, the gory scenes of death associated with the ravages of the virus in the village of Plimcombe. While writing the book and in the first rather harsh lockdown in the UK, I avidly listened to the news for any new information about how the real pandemic, the COVID pandemic, was unfolding. I was particularly gripped by the then unfolding disaster in Lombardy, in northern Italy, which was affected by a deadly first wave of COVID, and many of the discussions from the news in this specific time period also filtered into the storyline of pandemic. It is this interweaving of factual and imaginary parts of a story that are great fun to write. Like many books, such as Pandemic, some aspects of a story tend to be rooted in the real world, or at least inspired by things that have happened in reality. I also greatly enjoyed preparing the manuscript for publishing with my publisher Amazon KDP, designing the cover, and thinking about the best layout for the book. So hopefully this brief video has whetted your appetite to read Pandemic. If you found this video useful and you think this is a book that would interest you, please buy it. You may also be interested to watch other short videos on this channel where I talk about my book writing strategy and about other books I have written. And let me conclude by saying that, as with my other videos, let me finish by saying that we as authors would not be here without you, dear readers. So I hope that you will enjoy Pandemic, and I look forward to seeing your reviews on Amazon.